Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I am Harry Lasaniziris, and this is my YouTube channel grecochess. In this video, we continue the coverage of the Sept-o-ber chess tournament that was organized by the Queens Chess Club. In the previous video, we showed my first game, my first round game, and now we're going to show my second game. But let's first look at information, look at the details of the tournament. It takes place on 5 consecutive Fridays, starting from the 5th, going to the 12th, 1926, and October 3rd. In the previous video, we showed my first game from September 1st, where I started with a loss. And now we're going to show my second game from September 12th. It is a 5-round tournament, meaning every player is expected to play a total of 5 games on these 5 Fridays. And the time control for each game is G90 D5. What does it mean? When the game starts, players have 90 minutes on their clocks. And when it's their turn to play, for the first 5 seconds, the clock does not move, and then it continues going downwards from wherever it stopped before. And players should complete all their moves before the clock goes down to 0, otherwise you lose because of time. And as we continue, let me first present to you my opponent on round number 2. His name is John Thomas Flippen. He had a rating of 563 when the tournament at the time officially, but it's going to raise to 634 on October 1st. And he is in the 41.8 percentile. Compare this with my numbers. My rating was 1582 to be raised to 1609, and I'm in the 87th percentile. What does this mean? It means that clearly I'm the favorite, but I really need to admire and to commend John because he has the courage to play in a tournament with much stronger players than him, and believe me, that's the only way, or at least the best way, to improve. It's an example for all of us to emulate. But let's go to the chessboard of chess.com and see what actually happened. On the left half, you're going to see the chessboard, and I'm going to enter the moves as I copy them from my score sheet one by one from the beginning until the end. On the right half below the word analysis, you're going to see the computer evaluation. Positive number means the computer thinks white is doing better, and negative number, it means that according to the computer, black is doing better. Computer will show if the move played was the best, if not, which move would have been the best, and what are the top 3 options for the other player. I had the white pieces and John had the black. And let's see what happened. I start with my pawn going to e4, and John replies with what's called the perk defense. The pawn goes from d7 to d6. Second move, I completely occupy the center, pawn to d4, and John develops his knight to f6. Third move, knight goes to c3 for me, and pawn to g6 for John, preparing for fianchettoing, placing his bishop on g7 and controlling the long diagonal that goes from a1 to h8. Fourth move, my knight to f3, and as expected, bishop to g7. I don't want either his bishop or his knight to end in g4 because they exert a lot of pressure. That's why my pawn goes to h3 for my fifth move. While John castles, short side of course. Sixth move, my bishop goes to e3. And until now, everything is theory, book moves. And John will push his pawn to e5. This is a good but not the best move. It is good in the sense that it exerts pressure on d4 and occupies part of the center, but there's a problem, and the problem is that the e5 pawn is attacked twice by my pawn on d4 and my knight on f3, and defended only once by the queen on d8. But let's see how things will go now. I take the pawn on e5, John takes back. And time to exchange queens, because if I'm going to end up with a pawn ahead, why not exchange queens? And what I want to do now is I want to pin the knight on f6. My bishop goes to g5. And unlike the pin on the queen, John really needs to do something because the rook cannot take back on f6. If John decides to defend the pawn by placing his rook on e8, I can control the entire d-file by long castling. John decides to develop his other bishop, going to e6. And now it's time for me to take the pawn on e5, and I'm a pawn ahead. You see, I already have an advantage of 1.16. Of course, one pawn does not decide everything. The game is still going on. John attacks my bishop, pawn to h6. My bishop goes back to h4. The pin is still there. The knight on f6 cannot move. John develops his other knight to c6. And that is a mistake in the computer. My advantage becomes 2.06. And what I want to do now is exchange knights, not for the sake of the exchange, but by doing so, first of all, being a pawn ahead, I have fewer pieces on the board, and we are near the ending. And second, because his pawns are going to be doubled, he'll create a weakness. The pawns c7, c6 are what are called double isolated pawns. Not only they are doubled, meaning two pawns on the same file, but there are no pawns on the B and the D files to support them. My pawn goes to e5. And now I exert pressure because if the knight doesn't move, it will be taken. If it moves, I'm taking the rook. And perhaps if it moves, I only take an exchange because the other rook will take back my bishop. Maybe that would have been the best choice, but John decides to attack my bishop. And then I do the calculation. If we change pieces, then I can take a second piece, the bishop on g7. That's why it's a mistake, and I'm already 3.62. And I take the knight, so if John takes my bishop, I take the other bishop. But John instead decides to defend by taking the bishop. Minimize damage. Still, I'm 360 ahead. My bishop goes to g3. I want to save my bishop. And until now, have an extra piece, if you see correctly. Pawns are the same, but mine have a better pawn structure, 2 islands instead of 3. The rook goes to d7 for John. My bishop to d3, I develop my other bishop. And rook to d8, so John doubles his rooks on the d file. I castle. Pawn to h5. John starts an attack against my king. The bishop goes to e3 and attacks the pawn on c6. Not this to be defended because the rook cannot go to d6, the other bishop would take it. But he'll defend it by placing his bishop on d5. I'm ahead, why not exchange? Which has the side effect of undoubling his pawns. So one weakness for John is resolved that way. I attack the pawn on d5. And perhaps John's best hope would be to exchange knights, but then we are one piece nearer the ending. Instead, what he does is he defends the d5 pawn. It's attacked twice, defended twice. Maybe doesn't yet need defense, but to be safe, he pushes his pawn to c6 and defends the pawn on d5. My other rook goes to e1, and so I control the entire e-file. Pawn goes to h4 to attack my bishop. My bishop goes to e5, suggesting an exchange. And yes, John is going to exchange the dark-colored bishops. Pawn goes to f6, attacks my knight, and also protects the pawn at g5. My rook goes to e6 and threatens two pawns, the c6 and the f6. John defends one of them, the c6, so I grab the other one on f6. Rook goes to e8, so John occupies now the entire e-file. My rook goes to g6 with a check, and there are two choices for John. Either rook goes to g7 and we exchange rooks, and as I mentioned before, especially piece ahead, I want exchanges, or otherwise I'm going to take the pawn on g5. John decides to place his king on f7, which helps me grab the pawn on g5. Pawn goes to d7. My rook goes to g4 to attack the other pawn. Pawn goes to a6. I grab the pawn on h4. Rook goes to d6. My rook goes to f4 for a check. And rook goes to f6 to cover it. And since I'm ahead in material by one piece plus 3 pawns, I want to exchange. Because when you're ahead in material, when you change, you minimize the chances of blunders later on. Of course, this minimizes also the chance for your opponent to blunder. But if you're winning even without blunders of your opponent, you gain almost nothing. If they blunder, you get an extra piece. But if you blunder, you might end up behind and losing. That is the reason why I'm exchanging. Change the rooks. My king goes to f1, activate the king. Rook goes to e5. My rook goes to e1. Why not exchange the rooks if possible? But John says no. Rook goes to f5. My knight goes to e2. Give it a better position. Even though it goes backwards, hopefully later can go forward. Because from here, not easy to go forward. The pawns are controlling the squares. King goes to g7. Now my knight goes to d4, goes forward and attacks the rook. Rook goes back to f6. My rook goes to e6. Why not exchange rooks? I'm thinking because then I have a knight plus 3 extra pawns, and yes, we exchange rooks with a check, of course. I have a great position because I have knight plus 6 pawns against 3 of my opponent, and also 3 of my 6 pawns are passed pawns, in fact connected passed pawns, f2, g2, and h3, even though they are still in the beginning, but none of my opponent's pawns are passed. And I mention that because with the same material, if John had a passed pawn, one of the 3 on the second rank, no matter how much ahead there was no material, it would be hopeless. So one needs to look at the details. King goes to f7. Knight goes to c5 and attacks the pawn on a6. The pawn moves. Knight goes to b7, attacks again the pawn. Pawn goes to a4. Knight goes to c5. Now the pawn cannot be saved because if it goes to e3, I'll take it with my b pawn. I'm a little bit hesitating here because I think I have a typo in my notes. My notes say that the king went from f6 to e5. My king was on f7, and so doesn't matter. Let's pretend for the sake of argument that the king went to f6. My knight will take the pawn at a4. The pawn goes to d4. My king goes to e2. And John, with a smile on his face, he delivered a check on d3. And my king got a pawn, and John, at this point, he resigned. You see, I have a huge advantage of 12.7. And let's give a look at the review. What does the computer think about this game? It thinks that I had an accuracy of 96.6%, and I played as if my rating was 2500. In my dreams, I need to say, because these numbers are very, very flattering, I would say. Just to take in advance, the computer has no idea who was playing. I only enter the moves without mentioning any details about the players. And John's rating is 2150. This is, of course, extremely high. John, I would like to congratulate him. First of all, the first 5 moves he played exactly theory, which means that he's aware of the opening theory. And I really admire his courage and dedication to participate in these tournaments that are open to everyone and face much stronger opponents. And myself, I need to share it with you. I don't have this courage because if you remember in Connecticut, although I could participate in the under 2100 category, I went for the under 1700, the lowest I was eligible. But this means at this point, let's give a look at the details. I forgot, yes. No brilliant moves. I had 2 great. Best, I had 23 versus 13 for John. Excellent, 11 for me, 20 for John. Good, 1 for John. Book move, 6 for me, 5 for John. No inaccuracies. 1 mistake for me, 2 for John, and 1 blunder for John. This, and this concludes the coverage of the second round of the Sept-o-ber tournament from the Queens Chess Club. The next video is going to be the third round that took place a week ago. And hopefully in the video after that, I'll have tonight's game, the fourth round game. As I mentioned before, there are a total of 5 games. I started the tournament with 1 win and 1 loss, as you've seen. We'll see in the next video how did I do in the third round. Ladies and gentlemen, thanks for watching. Thanks to the subscribers. If you have not done so, just click the subscribe button. It doesn't take too much. Thanks to the likes and to the nice comments. I'm Harry Lasaniziris. This is GrecoChess YouTube channel. Goodbye.